Hello, everyone. I think since the time is up, let's get started. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to our Friday lecture organized by the Philosophy Department and the Institute of Foreign Philosophy of Peking University. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Sophia, Connell, one of the world leading experts in Aristotle, in particular his biology. She will give us a talk with an interesting title, Aristotle on Women's Virtues. Before her lecture, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Professor Connell. She got her PhD from the University of Cambridge. Now she's teaching ancient philosophy and science at the Beck College, University of London. She is the author of 2 monographs, which I highly recommend. Aristotle on Female Animals, a study of the generation of animal, Cambridge University Prize 2016, and Aristotle on Women, Physiology, Psychology, and Politics, Cambridge last year. She's also the main editor of the recent published Cambridge Companion to Aristotle's Biology. Her research interests are not limited to Asian philosophy. She has also published works on contemporary virtue ethics, feminist philosophy, and the role of women in early analytic philosophy. Now she's developing new research on the female body in the ancient philosophical and medical texts. So please join me in welcoming Professor Connell.
Thank you very much, Wei. So my paper is called Aristotle on Women's Virtues. And I'm inspired to write this because I often teach contemporary virtue ethics. And I teach a lot of Aristotle, but people ask me, surely Aristotle didn't think that women could be virtuous. So you have to only talk about men when you talk about Aristotle. And that disturbs me. So I look into Aristotle to see if he has machinery to talk about virtues for women. And I discover that he has the framework to talk about women's virtues. He doesn't do it very much because he's mostly concerned with men. And then I developed that framework a little bit within the context of his society and come to some conclusions about the limitations of the virtue that he ascribes or allows to women. So I'll just read out, I hope that you'll be able to see this text as well to follow. So Aristotle is notorious for his misogyny. And one ground for this assessment is that he...
I think, Connell, Sophia, you can share the screen, perhaps.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I will share the slides. Yeah. So Aristotle is notorious for his misogyny. And one reason for this is that people say he thinks women are not capable of virtue. They can't be happy or lead good lives because they have a natural defect. Now, while in some way this is true of his view, I challenge the idea that women cannot be virtuous in fundamentally the same way as men, according to Aristotle's theory. This paper will speculate about what women's virtues would be for Aristotle, and it attempts to tread a line between what Aristotle actually thought and what he should have thought, given his theories. On the basis of his writings, I argue that the difference between the virtues of men and those of women don't show any ethical weakness in women, but only the weakness of an arbitrary political rule over them. The two sexes operate in differently valued realms. Men run cities, and cities have more value, and women run households, and households have lesser value. That limits women's political power, but it doesn't mean they are incapable of virtue. On the contrary, the bad fortune of being born a woman in ancient Greece is mitigated by the importance of their virtuous characters and activities. For Aristotle, without virtuous women, the city would fail to flourish. But there are still reasons to disparage his attitude towards the best of women, because he believes that their virtues are to be hidden away. Another reason to be skeptical about his view is that given that women's virtues are the same as men's virtues, morally speaking, Aristotle has no good reason to exclude women from politics. It's only the exercise of force and power that keeps the world segregated along gendered lines. And before I proceed, I want to mention that I deal with a lot of conflicting views in Aristotle's texts. From one place to another, he says different things. And I don't think it's always best to try and force consistency. You have to acknowledge that he's saying different things in different places. And I believe that he doesn't have a clear or straightforward view on women. Today, I'll present an outline of this research, which is focused on the character or moral virtues of women. I don't have time to fully consider the intellectual virtues, but there's a case to be made for these as well. First of all, I'll try to circumvent the objection that Aristotle thinks that women are incapable of virtue because they are chronically ecratic meaning weak-willed. Next, I'll set out what Aristotle says about women's virtues in the politics, where it seems that only men have real virtues or full virtues and women have some kind of lesser kind of virtue. That's his most negative account. And I'll argue that ultimately Aristotle does not, or at least should not, support the view that men's and women's virtues differ at a fundamental level. This is where we turn to the ethics. Virtue is broadly defined in the ethics, and it should cover every time that you act virtuously, including the actions of women. So I'll argue that women's virtues differ because they are virtues to do with the things that women are concerned with in the household. The third section of the paper will go through a number of virtues from Aristotelian ethics and attempt to map these onto what women's lives would have looked like at the time. And I end with some ideas about the limitations and contradictions of this point of view. In explaining different kinds of rule within the household in his book, The Politics, Aristotle says women's deliberative capacity is akeiron. The most influential interpretation of this saying is intrapersonal, inside the person. So the idea is that women are not in control of themselves, and they're not in control of their lower appetites. Now, I've argued in recent work for the other reading, the interpersonal reading, that women don't have power in the community, that women's deliberations don't have external authority. It's not internal, it's external. But here I'll only touch on the negative case, why it's implausible to suppose that women are chronically ecratic, according to Aristotle. The first problem for this view is that Aristotle often mentions that women should be virtuous and happy. For instance, in the politics and ethics and the rhetoric. He also emphasizes the importance of education and virtue for all citizens, including women. In fact, he makes a point that women weren't trained to be virtuous in some cities, and that led to trouble, for instance, in Sparta. When women are discussed in his ethical and political works, Aristotle is focusing on those he sees as the most influential in the city, the citizen wives. These women are responsible for running households, which entails difficult and complicated sets of tasks, such as care for those who are ill, preparation and distribution of food, and managing expenses, amongst other tasks. It wouldn't make sense to leave such tasks in the hands of somebody who's completely unable to control herself. Euripides' Medea had the masculine problem of not being in control of her temper, thumos. That's a different thing. And besides that, she represents a foreigner rather than a Greek woman. And so I resist the attempt to generalize from such characters to an Aristotelian view of women as acratic. Another reason to resist this view of female psychology is it doesn't fit with Aristotle's descriptions and explanations of the phenomena of acrasia. Acrasia is not something that's incurable. It can't be chronic. If a person were permanently unable to control their lower appetites, this would be a case of pathological bestiality, as he explains in the Nicomachean Ethics. And there's no indication that Aristotle views all women as bestial. Indeed, it may be that for Aristotle, women look more likely to act in a civilized manner, more likely than men, because men are more spirited, women are less spirited, and spirit is the basis for wildness and impetuosity. In the biology, he says that female animals are easier to handle and easier to tame. They are less wild. Having established that there are reasons to think that for Aristotle, women can be virtuous, I turn to his politics. Now, it seems here that if women do have virtues, these are different from and not as good as the virtues of men. Clearly then, this is a quote from Aristotle, clearly then moral virtues belongs to them all, that is, to rulers and to subjects, but the temperance of a man and a woman, or the courage and justice of a man and of a woman are not, as Socrates maintained, the same. The courage of a man is as ruling and of a woman as assistant, and this holds for all other virtues. One presumes the discussion in Plato's Meno is in the background, and here Aristotle agrees with the character Gorgias in that dialogue more than with Socrates. Gorgias posited that virtue is performing a certain task well. The virtue of a woman, he says, is ordering the house well, preserving the things inside, and being obedient to her husband. The second idea we find in the politics is that women's virtues are lesser than men's virtues. Now, the thought that virtue might exist on a scale may not necessarily strike us as odd. You might think that bravely facing a fierce dog is a bit less worthy than bravely facing an axe-wielding murderer. But you could also think that what this describes is not so much one virtue being lesser than the other, but that you display your virtue more in one situation, which requires more courage, than in the other, which requires less courage, but it's the same disposition. But what's claimed here is that the virtues displayed by one sex of person are better than the same virtues displayed by the other sex of person. And why would that be? At one point, Aristotle further explains why it is that women's virtues are somehow flavored by being ruled over, as opposed to male virtues, which are connected to ruling. Quote, for clearly a man's virtue, for example, his justice, will not be one and the same when he is under government and when he is free, but it will be of different kinds, one fitting him to rule and one to be ruled, just as temperance and courage are different in a man and in a woman, for a man would be thought a coward if he were only as brave as a brave woman, and a woman a chatterer if she was only as modest as a good man. One can understand, given these texts, why many commentators conclude that for Aristotle, women cannot have genuine virtues. While that's a viable interpretation, I think it worth considering whether one could think in Aristotelian terms that citizen women could be truly virtuous in a very general sense. This would be advantageous for several reasons in our interpretation of Aristotle's ethics and politics. If they could not have virtue in any real sense in Aristotle's mind, why does he bother discussing their virtues and their happiness? Also, to allow for this possibility makes better sense of their important role in the household, particularly as mothers. Sometimes he indicates that women's virtues, like those of men, aim towards the common good of the community. No person exists without such a community, including women. What we count as self-sufficient is not what suffices for a solitary person by herself, living an isolated life, but what suffices also for parents, children, wife, and in general for friends and fellow citizens, since a human being is a naturally political animal. When we turn to the ethical works, sorry, I've lost my place slightly in the slides. One of them skipped. Yeah, we're here. Okay. When we turn to the ethical works, the idea that the virtues of one sex are fundamentally different from or lesser than that of the other is very strained. Virtues are not things like cleaning the house well or riding a horse well. They're general dispositions that preside over any and every relevant activity. Like Socrates and Plato, Aristotle seeks one common definition for all virtues in his ethics. And he gives this as virtue is a state that decides consisting in a mean, which is defined by reference to reason. In short, the idea that virtue differs with social role or function is incongruous with Aristotelian ethics, where he says the happy person lives well and does well. The good person combines practical wisdom, phronesis, with character virtues. They always decide correctly in each situation they are faced with. But the situation is various, depending on their social role. Recall that the politics linked virtue to ruling, or at least male virtue. In the ethics, in contrast, both sexes might be virtuous so long as they rule over their own internal desires. The politics goes so far as to propose that at one point that only an actual political ruler can have the virtue of phronesis. And I give you that reference. Some are sure this means women cannot have virtue, since phronesis is required for moral virtue in Aristotle's ethics, as I've just explained. But if only those who can be rulers can be good, this is incredibly restrictive and excludes most men in most cities. Aristotle can't mean for this theory of virtue to be so narrow. Indeed, in the same text, he later makes clear that virtue does have a broader scope for all those in a community who share in promoting civic well-being. A common definition applies to them all. He writes, while the precise definition of each individual's virtue applies exclusively to them, at the same time, a common definition is applicable to them all. Since I take it, good women for Aristotle promote civic well-being, they also can be virtuous in this common manner. Moreover, even though Aristotle indicates that the virtues of men and women are different, he doesn't state that women's virtues are not virtues. Women's virtues can be understood then as proper virtues, that is, not fundamentally different from the virtues of men. And I'm not alone in thinking this. I give a list of other scholars, such as Dominic Scott, who also believe this to be the case. The difference between the virtues of men and women concern the objects and activities to which they are directed. Turning to the rhetoric, Aristotle suggests that the value of virtue is related to the subject or agent rather than the objects or activities. Here he says virtuous actions are nobler when they proceed from those who are naturally worthier, for example, from a man rather than from a woman. This fits very badly with Aristotelian ethics, where the worth of the subject has to do with their virtue and not with, and the virtue doesn't come after and depend on some kind of external view of whether that person is worthy or not. We have to keep in mind that the rhetoric concentrates on how to persuade audiences. And so it has to take into account the common people and what their view is. So many of the ideas and values espoused in the rhetoric are not those of Aristotle or not of his more sophisticated philosophical ethics. But there are clues in the rhetoric, in this work, about how to rank women and men's virtues. So in the rhetoric, he often uses this rhetorical trope to associate an activity or capacity with the value of the relevant objects it is involved with. For example, theoretical activity concerning the stars is more valuable than theoretical activity knowing about animals and plants. This is what he says in the parts of animals. But there's an advantage to studying animals and plants because epistemically, we are better placed to understand and teach about them. So we are sometimes better placed to deal with objects that aren't the noblest. In fact, it's more appropriate for us to study and teach about animals and plants than to spend all of our time on the more honorable objects. This sort of reasoning can apply to men and women and virtue. Displaying virtues which deal with nobler objects are nobler virtues, the virtues of men. But just as the noblest objects are not always the appropriate ones for us to study, so also we could argue that the noblest ethical objects are not always the most appropriate to the person in question. And this is certainly the case for women in Aristotle's philosophy. Being born a woman in Aristotle's time debarred a person from certain of the objects and domains of men, quite a few, in fact. But women's virtues are what are appropriate to them, and it would be wrong of them to pursue virtues that were not in there, that they aren't able to access. They aren't able to access the objects, then they shouldn't be displaying those virtues. But women's virtues are, so they find themselves in particular circumstances that require them to pay their attention to the less noble objects. The idea of men's virtues being better then relates to the fact that the sphere in which they operate is deemed of greater human significance, which is the political influence in legislation, policy, and the running of the constitution. But it's important not to exaggerate this, the nobility of the objects that men deal with, because for Aristotle, the oikos, the household, is of central importance. It is central to the polis, and when he says at one point, he says that the polis is for living well, but that's in the context where there's either people scattered about who are not able to organize themselves at all, and in that context, he says the polis is much better. But in the context of there being a good polis, it's absolutely essential to the polis that there be households within it which are well run. So he even says that the household, the oikos, where the woman is supreme, is more necessary than the polis. Households that are part of cities are for living well. For example, in the education of young children within them, and also in the mutual support and friendship of husband and wife, which he describes in the Ethics as follows. The friendship of husband and wife also seems to be natural, for human beings naturally tend to form couples more than to form cities, to the extent that the household is prior to the city and more necessary. Human beings share a household not only for childbearing, but also for the benefits in their life. For from the start, their functions are divided with different ones for the man and the woman. Hence, each supplies the other's needs by contributing a special function to the common good. Hence, their friendship seems to include both utility and pleasure, and it may also be a friendship of virtue if they are decent. Aristotle has these three types of friendship, and the highest one is the virtue friendship. And he's saying here that husband and wife have that kind of friendship. So in marital friendship, There must be, if not an absolute sameness in virtue, an equivalence. The virtues of wife and husband underpin their friendship. And later on, he says, friendship consists in equality and similarity, especially the similarity of those who are alike in virtue. As Aristotle goes on to explain, such friends help each other to be and remain good people. While much can be made of the superior role of men in the polis, it's in the oikos where values and affections are formed and maintained across generations. This need for personal friendship is crucial to what humans are, because for the human being is a pairing and householding animal in the first instance. That's another quote from Aristotle. Pairing and householding animal. In the same spirit, Aristotle rejects a social contract view of the development and sustenance of human political communities. He writes, it's clear that a state is not a mere society, having a common place established for the prevention of mutual crime and for the sake of exchange. These are conditions without which a state cannot exist, but all of them together do not constitute a state, which is a community of families and aggregations of families in well-being for the sake of a perfect and self-sufficing life. Such a community can only be established among those who live in the same place and intermarry. Hence, there arise cities, family connections, brotherhoods, common sacrifices, amusements which draw people together. But these are created by friendship. For to choose to live together is friendship. The end of the state is the good life, and these are the means towards it. A polis is made up of both genders of person. In the context of this community, the virtues of women are crucial and a concern for politics. For just as man and wife are part of a household, it's clear that the polis also is divided nearly in half into its male and female population. Yes, women's virtues are different from men's because their role is to attend to the tasks within the oikos, the household. Their virtue will be to do these things well. Allowing that in Aristotelian terms, women can be virtuous makes better sense of the emphasis he places on marital character friendship and the role of mothers and the role of women as maternal moral exemplars. Male and female friendship in marriage involves a superiority, yes, of the man over the woman, but this is due to political power and not to character virtue. It's possible for them to have comparable moral worth, or else they couldn't be virtue friends. Now, to test out my hypothesis that women's virtues are fundamentally similar to any other virtues, I'll consider a number of Aristotelian virtues and how they could have been displayed by ideal citizen women. While the four canonical virtues are the focus of politics books 7 to 8, that is courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom, those detailed in the Nicomachean Ethics books 3 to 5 are more various. Many of these particular virtues paint a picture of the lives of Greek men, Greek elite men, in fact. They involve objects and resources not available to women, such as property and freely moving around. So it will be necessary to think creatively about how these virtues might apply to Greek women at the time of Aristotle. Aristotle himself didn't do this. There is more scope to fit the canonical virtues to ancient feminine roles in the typical Greek city-state. This is the general flavor of Xenophon's account of how to train a young wife in household management. Both husband and wife in his account have temperance, courage, and prudence. They just apply them to different realms, the one to the external and the other to the internal. This is also something that certain Stoic thinkers express later on, such as Musonius Rufus. From the evidence of his ethics, at least, it isn't correct to oppose Aristotle to those positions, to the Xenophon and the Stoics. Instead, I think his views exist on the same continuum. Women's virtues have to do with domesticity and their given role in society. Women require equivalent character training to men in acquiring and preserving these general dispositions. Ancient Greek women in the elite citizen class, which was the primary concern of all of these philosophers, would have had tasks such as this: managing servants, the economics of feeding people, nursing, textiles, care, and early education of the young. There are also crises to consider. While war is seemingly the province of men, it profoundly affected the lives of women, as many Greek tragedies attest. What happens if your city is defeated? What happens when the men are away fighting? What happens if your child, husband, or father dies? These are phenomena that many Greek women faced. So now let's consider a number of virtues from the Nicomachean Ethics, a work by Aristotle, and their potential application to such women. Begin with courage. In the Politics, Aristotle says that a man would be thought a coward if he were only as courageous as a courageous woman. The typical arena for considering courage, literally manliness, Andrea, is the battlefield. Men must risk life and limb in combat. Ancient Greek women were not required, and indeed not permitted, to fight in this manner. I leave out Sparta for now. Typically, very few would have received training in childhood, such as sparring and wrestling, to prepare them to consider bodily aggression as part of their lives. They would also not have learned how to handle weaponry. Given this, it's hardly surprising that if faced with physical attack or taking up a sword, a woman would have been fearful and not displayed the courage of a man. But in the sphere of being a woman, there is scope for a courage that men do not and cannot display. That is, the courage to persist in the goal of producing new life from one's body through pregnancy, miscarriage, stillbirth, live birth, and constant feeding. With extremely high rates of infant mortality, the perseverance required would have been formidable. Without the possibility of the sort of medical assistance that the present day global North and South takes to be standard, any elite status would make no difference whatsoever to these outcomes. Rich and poor women alike are killed by these processes. Perhaps you think that women didn't have a choice about whether to undergo these dangers, and so cannot be counted as courageous. But it's arguable that men in societies that require ubiquitous training and a commitment to combat, there's no choice for them either. The choice comes in the way that individuals face these inevitable physical and psychological challenges. This will broadly amount to a similar type of character trait to the courage that Aristotle describes in the Ethics as an ability to stand firm against what's painful. The frequency and horror of perinatal death in this society merits the application of Aristotle's following statement to these women. Quote, hence someone is called courageous to the fullest extent if he is intrepid in facing a fine death and the immediate dangers that bring death. He was biased in following up with, this is above all true in the dangers of war. Okay, let's go on. Another area of expertise in which women will display courage is in the onset and aftermath of war and conquest. The noble goal here can be generally characterized in terms of the preservation of the values held in a certain community. Values that may be about to be lost or eradicated through military defeat or the genocidal actions of invaders. Such scenarios occur frequently in Greek tragedy. Iphigenia is a female character Aristotle refers to a number of times. Agamemnon, her father, feels he must sacrifice his virgin daughter in order for the winds to take him and his troops to join the invasion of Troy. Like many tragic heroines, Iphigenia is fully aware of the significance of her role. She's not passive to her fate, but decides on it as the best way forward. Her life thus gains dignity in joining her will to her fate. She also has the power to express how ironic the situation is for her, how in endorsing the civilized standing of her own community, she acquiesces to this seemingly barbaric act. Her rationale for willingly giving up her life is that, quote, Greeks shall not be ruled by barbarians, but the act of taking the life of an innocent young woman doesn't seem a civilized one at all. Another theme in tragedy is the vulnerability of women in the aftermath of war, who can expect abuse and who are often required to submit to sex and to have children with the very men who killed their own loved ones. Polexena, virgin Trojan princess, chooses death over the prospect of this outcome. For those who did not have the option of being murdered, their ability to face pain is also significant, to be courageous in Aristotle's terms. It may be thought that there's no dignity or nobility in becoming somebody's slave, and yet courage is evident in such situations, manifesting itself in an ability to honor and remember the places that they came from. For example, they will raise their children with the values they grew up with, even if these children are not wholly from their own culture. They will perhaps gain some standing in the new community through cooperation or love. And in this, they'll need to suppress fear inspired by memories of past violence. Whether choosing to continue, join to the enemy tribe, or to die instead, these women, the women who face the aftermath of war, have the courage to endure their fate. These inevitabilities are depicted in many stories. These don't give us soft, weak, or emotional women. The assumption that this is the only or even the main Greek view of womankind is surely questionable. For example, Karen Nielsen writes, in his discussion of bravery, Aristotle contrasts bravery with malakia, softness, arguing that while the brave person stands firm because this is fine and because everything else is shameful, the coward dies for the sake of erotic passion or to avoid poverty or something painful. Women have a similar flaw, according to Nielsen. But staying strong during the process of giving birth without anesthesia is not something that a soft person does. And if a woman dies giving birth, she knows the value of her efforts on behalf of the community. She can hardly be said to have died in cowardice. That is, she didn't die in the pursuit of erotic passion or to avoid pain and poverty. Given the enormous risks involved in bearing children and being the ones left after war and conquest, the following seems applicable to women in Greek society. Besides, it's true, as they say, that the virtuous person labors for their friends and for their native country, and will die for them if they must. They will sacrifice money, honor, and contested goods in general in achieving what is fine. Although the people who Aristotle discusses in the Nicomachean Ethics are men, this description of the virtuous person could apply to the cases detailed here of the courage of both ordinary and heroic Greek women. When it comes to justice, the female variety may be different because it is employed with respect to different objects and within different parameters from male justice. Within the home, women have to share out food for the entire household, exercising proportional justice. As a metaphor for the distribution of nourishment in embryological development, Aristotle turns to the work of the good housekeeper. Like a good housekeeper, nature is not accustomed to throw anything away if something useful can be made out of it. In housekeeping, the best of the food available is reserved for the free men. The residue left over from this, as well as the inferior goods, goes to the servants, and the rest of it goes to the domestic animals. Hence, this is an instance of a mind external to them acting so as to provide for their growth. Okay, so he compares that to embryological development. This procedure of meting out food using your mind to do so requires careful consideration of the needs of the individuals involved, a case of sensitivity to the particulars, which is part of virtue, according to Aristotle. Maintaining a healthy household through nutrition is traditionally the province of women, just as judging how frequently to nurse and breastfeed children, especially in the precarious first few months. One might object that male heads of households actually had ultimate control over the distribution of food, but it seems highly unlikely that they had the time or inclination to become involved. Another area to place under justice is sexual activity within marriage. Although it can be inferred from Aristotle's account of the superiority of husbands that their wives owe them more affection than they are given, husbands and wives owe each other completely equivalent sexual fidelity in Aristotle. This view is unorthodox at the time. There was usually a double standard where the wife had to be faithful, but the husband didn't. But Aristotle had this unusual, unorthodox view that both partners owed each other the same sexual fidelity. Temperance. Temperance concerns moderation with respect to the pleasures of touch and taste. Since the objects are the same for men and women, why would Aristotle think that temperance differs for them, as he remarks in the Politics? Although he never explicitly says so, one possibility is that he considers temperance to require more effort for women because of their different bodily condition. Women, for Aristotle, have softer and more sensitive skin and flesh. And by the way, this makes them just as, if not more, capable of intelligence, according to Aristotle. So they have softer and more sensitive skin and flesh. And this will possibly make them feel things more acutely. It'll also make them more sensitive to music. Aristotle describes the people who have intense desires and pleasures in his Ethics as melancholics. In melancholic men, their constitution causes their body continual turmoil, and they are always having intense desires. A pain is driven out by its contrary pleasure, indeed by any pleasure at all that's strong enough. And this is why such people become intemperate and base. Now there he's talking about men. Although Aristotle never says that women are constitutionally similar to melancholic men, he may have thought this. That would mean that temperance is a harder task for girls. However, there's no indication that he thinks them incapable of it. Indeed, female temperance will be absolutely essential to the proper running of the oikos and the polis. Some think that Aristotle thought women to be especially sexually intemperate. For instance, Robert Mayhew. What little evidence there is for this comes from the discussion of human reproduction in the Historia Animalium. Here, quote, the females who are sexually active while young become more intemperate, and so do the males if they are unguarded, for the channels become dilated and make an easier passage for fluids in this part of the body. The passage doesn't state that it's only girls that have strong desires and must be more carefully watched than boys. It emphasizes that no person, whether boy or girl, should begin to have sexual intercourse too young, since this sets the body up for an increase in the fluids that leads to an increase in sexual need. Aristotle recommends that girls marry at age 18. That's a good 4 or 5 years later than the age his contemporaries favored. This shows that he must have thought it very important to cultivate self-control in women in those years between puberty and marriage. If girls are more prone to the melancholic bodily state than boys, then they will need to be more vigilant. But this presumably would be part of their education concerning virtue. 2 more to think about. Mildness. Mildness, proates, is the virtue concerned with anger or temper, orgas. Aristotle states that there is no common name for this condition, and it is inclined towards deficiency, meaning that it's really that this virtue is an absence of angry temper. That an absence of anger and temper is a virtue. He urges that we focus on deficiency of temper, even though there are tendencies in his society to praise people who get irritated as, there's this tendency in his society to, quote, praise people who get irritated as manly and fitted to command. But he doesn't agree with that. That's what his society says, but he doesn't agree with this. This is a clear hint that those considered manly by others are not actually hitting the right mean, according to Aristotle. It's much better to be deficient in manly temper. So it's much better to have the temperament that comes more easily to a woman. Men are more likely to fly into a rage at everything, given their more spirited natural temperament. As is noted by many historians of anger, women in Aristotle's world would have had very little power to exact revenge, which is the typical response to angry emotions. But in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle advocates that condition, not seeking revenge. Quote, the mild person is ready to pardon, not eager to exact a penalty. This is arguably a feminized state of mind. Thus, unlike temperance, mildness will be a virtue that women find easier than men to achieve. Although magnanimity concerns honor, the good person knows that ultimately it's being generous that is more noble, and that honor is not worth anything on its own. This is the upshot of Aristotle's discussion of magnanimity. And I think this is close to the attitude of the ideal mother figure in the Nicomachean Ethics, who's more concerned with generous love than with being honored. Quote, friendship seems to be more in the loving rather than in the being loved. A sign of this is that mothers rejoice in loving. For some mothers give away their own children to be nursed, and loving them, they know them, but they do not seek to be loved in return, should it not be possible to have both. But it seems to be sufficient to them if they see and know that the children do well, and they love them, even though those children do not render to the mother honor as a mother. The theme of friendship is an important one for Aristotle's vision of the good life and the successful community. Friendship holds together the polis. It creates unity, and no state can work without it. Friendship requires personal relationships, people who are special to each other. These relationships are maintained by living together, meaning constant discussion and care for the goals of friends. In a close-knit culture like Aristotle's, women are the ultimate social glue, which is why mother and child are the paradigm of the ideal friendship, where love is unconditionally given. What does this interpretation tell us about Aristotle's attitude toward women? On the positive side, it seems that if we treat women's virtues as fundamentally the same as men's, differing due to different objects and activities, then it is possible to find that this helps support Aristotle's vision for the good citizen and the good community. Citizen women in their married relation will ideally maintain a friendship of character with their husbands. Thus, they support each other's virtuous activities, and they're able to deliberate together about important matters. Without allowing for female virtues, these advantages would be lost. Citizen wives will also be encouraged to become mothers of citizens, both boys and girls. In this role, virtue will be crucial. For how will the next generation be virtuous if they are not raised and cared for by another virtuous human? And finally, crucial for the continuity of human communities is the collective consciousness and continuation of culture and value. With their milder and more affectionate nature, according to Aristotle, women are well placed to foster and maintain love and friendship between and across generations. And it would certainly seem very difficult for this to happen without those people themselves being good and recognizing the fine and the noble. While traditional roles for women, particularly citizen women or wives, in the idealized polis are crucial, we must also recognize the negatives of this account. As some feminist scholars have noted, Aristotle suppresses what women contribute to the good of humanity and the polis. Skills in nurture, virtue, and intelligence are required in women, but this is never explained or highlighted, and certainly not celebrated in any of his works. Indeed, in the way that they are praised for their love, its public presence is erased. Women love even when the honor that's due to them as a parent is not present. Women are not supposed to mind being invisible, hiding out while also being crucially important to the good functioning of the human community. Thus, Aristotle's ideal woman her virtue is not only to be good, at a very many things through effort and devotion to these tasks and performing them from a virtuous disposition, but she must also remain unrecognized. To become invisible is the fate of people limited in the scope of their deliberations. But I think that this is not natural, but cultural. Other female animals, unless they are domesticated and imposed on by the will of human beings, are not inferior in their activities or ways of life to their male counterparts. Some female animals even surpass their male counterparts, as in the case of certain dogs and of spiders, leopards, and deer. Human women are held back by social structures. The polis, the main arena for human flourishing, cannot operate without subservient women within the oikos. But this situation lies more in what humans do with their natural situation than in nature itself. Thus, typical male virtues championed by Aristotle are not due to any superiority in terms of effort, but rather are due to blind chance. It's due to chance that the mixture in conception results in a male rather than in a female child. The male child, because of physical strength and spiritedness, will eventually be provided with more external and contingent resources to achieve male virtues. Ancient Greek culture did not just allow for this domination of one gender over the other, but actively promoted it. In that setting, being born as a female child is most unlucky. But Aristotle downplayed the role of fortune in happiness and virtue. And it's possible from that vantage point that women, while curtailed, can employ inner resources to achieve virtue. He writes, good people are those least affected by fortune, who bear fortune most finely. On Aristotle's own terms, if women have what's fundamentally the same capacity for virtue as men do, then making women stick to a womanly sphere and debarring them from any public decision-making is unjustified. Their lack of political influence is circumstantial rather than fundamental. Both men and women in ancient Greek culture live in a society that allows those with more strength to oppress those who are physically weaker. It also reinforces this behavior. At one point, Aristotle states that power should not be the advantage of the stronger. But when it comes to power over women, he's not opposed to it, showing how the force of sexism often disrupts otherwise sound principles in his philosophy. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with women which would make them incapable of political influence and even rule. Indeed, it's clear that Aristotle knew this. He certainly knew of women who were leaders and even some who were founders of constitutions, for instance, in Egypt and Phoenicia. He writes, the greatest benefactor is one who constructs a new constitution. So the women who have achieved this are as valued as any other political benefactor. Ultimately, the prejudices which lead Aristotle to exclude women from political life remain in tension with his philosophical ethics. Aristotle's view ultimately seems to rest on the idea of appropriateness. Given that they are born as female, women should not try to do what men do. To say that their objects are less noble, as in the politics, or that their person is less noble, as in the rhetoric, is empty of force when they could never become men and engage with the objects and in the fields that men do. They must accept that those with more strength and spirit will not allow them to have any political power. Thus, Aristotle's philosophy undermines women's political freedom, but he never has any good grounds on his own terms to do so. There's even less good reason to think that women are incapable of philosophy. Since political leadership is not a prerequisite for the development of theoretical understanding, and indeed the two often do not go together, women's ability to think is never denied by Aristotle. But since they are consumed with domestic tasks and hidden away, these capacities may never be nurtured. And that is considered by, it was considered by Aristotle that their philosophical abilities were rightly curtailed. there's this passage in the Poetics where he says that women shouldn't be too clever and do philosophical type things. So sorry, I end on that negative note, but that's the end.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Sophia. Thanks for your fascinating and somehow unorthodox talk. So now let's move to the Q&A section. I think our audience must have many questions. The audience can either use the raise hand option to tell us that you want to talk, and then you can open your mic according to the order, or you can, I think, leave questions on the message board, and Sophia can select the question she wants to answer. So now the floor is open to questions. Okay, I think first, perhaps Liu Wei.
So I will turn on my video. Thank you very much, Professor Connell, for this wonderful talk. And you really give a very strong, probably the strongest I can imagine defense for Aristotle's view about women's virtue. But well, when I'm teaching Aristotle's politics, especially, I always say sorry to the female students for those misogyny comments from Aristotle. But if what you said was just right, then next time I shouldn't have said that. But I still have some doubts about whether that defense is completely successful. The first one is about your very novel interpretation of the word acron in the politics. So you interpret it as interpersonal instead of intrapersonal, just to say that this acron means women doesn't control political things, cannot control other people. But I think in this context, when Aristotle says a slave doesn't have this deliberative part, boleotikon, and female has it, but it lacks control. And the kids have it, but incomplete. I think all those comments are toward inside, either incomplete or has it, but not in control. I think it's in control of herself, to a certain extent at least. And this kind of intrapersonal aspect, I think can be supported by a passage in the Nicomachean Ethics, book 7, chapter 7. When he said, well, it is completely understandable to give in to strong and excessive pleasure and pains. But if you are just surrendering too easily to those mild pains, it will be a wonder. And he said, well, I will just read on this passage. It is something to wonder as if he does this where things that ordinary people can successfully struggle against are concerned. And if he gives in to and cannot struggle successfully against these, or unless it is because of this genial nature or because there is congenial softness in Scythian kings, or as female differs in relation to male in this regards. So it seems that, well, the female rationality has some weakness in controlling the non-rational part. And also related to this is your comment on the chronic acrasia, and you said the chronic acrasia would be like bestiality instead of acrasia, because acrasia is curable. Right, acrasia is curable, but Aristotle never says it is easily curable. It's just curable. And the passage you quote to say chronic acrasia is like bestiality, I don't think that passage says that. It only says so still about the extreme sorts of behavior, such as the female who people say used to rip open pregnant women and devour their children, or the pleasure said to be enjoyed by some of the savages who live around Black Sea. So for these kind of things, these are bestiality, but not chronic acrasia. Okay, this is the question about acron. Can I raise another question about the political role? I'm going
to forget all of that if I don't answer
sure.
something.
Definitely. Please.
Yeah. Now, can you just remind me where you began with the politics and apologizing to your students?
Yeah, and the two passages in the ethics.
And then you said, but the acuron is where you, Well, yeah, there is a tradition of sort of arguing on one side and the other. And like many of these philosophical discussions, there are obviously strong arguments on both sides. That's why we have this debate. But I still feel as if everything falls more heavily on the side of the interpersonal, and particularly because Aristotle talks about women's virtues and training their virtues. And I think if he thought that they could, that would always just remain unable to control their inner desires, then why would he bother? He would just have external rules to control them. He wouldn't think that they'd need to try and understand and become virtuous from the inside. Now, the context, you say, is that it's talking about the slave and the child. There's a lot of problems with his view about the slave, as you probably know. And one of the problems is that at one point he says, you can be friends with the slave as a person, but not as a slave. And so it's like that there's something about the slave's political position in a way that makes them unable to deliberate. So there could be a similarity in that way. Leave aside the child for now. And there's some study on this word akouros as well, which says that it's mostly used as something to for instance, there's a law that's been annulled or is not working or something like that. So that word is, he could have used a word that to indicate, he could have used one of the words from his ethics to indicate inability to control oneself. That's what he thought women had. So all of those things lead me to the interpersonal view. Now, what was remind me the point after that? You read some things from the Nicomachean Ethics about Acrisia. Yes, good. Okay. I know the passage about the Persians and the women. So Persians were supposed to be feminine, and to kind of drag their cloaks along the ground and weep and things like this. So they're soft. Again, I think when he's talking mainly about men, right? When he's talking about akrasia, he's mainly talking about men who are weak-willed, and maybe the Asians also have some kind of environmental reason because it's hot there. You probably teach the politics 7, book 7. So perhaps they get all soft because it's too hot when they're being formed. Or I don't quite understand those passages. But I think that having at one point in the discussion, and I can't put my finger on it right now, but he says that some people have a kind of natural constitution different from others. And so, but as long as you know that, as long as you know you're somebody who's more prone to being acratic in this way rather than that way, you can guard against it. And so in that context, like I said about temperance, it may be that women's softer skin means that they feel stuff and it feels a lot nicer to them. They have to be more careful, and you've got to educate them about that. That's my view there. That's, I think, my view there. Rather than, Aristotle has two sides in the ethics. The side I like is where he wants us to be in control of ourselves and to understand how to lead a good life. The other side is kind of external control, where he says, it's like when you're educated in book 9 and 10, when you're educated in the wrong city, then there's no point in, we just have to force you to do things, and we're not going to bother with educating you anymore because you've just passed the point where we can make any difference. But he advocates educating children, both girls and boys, in the politics in book 7. So girls have to have training as well for virtue. So I think that he's thinking that they should be able to control themselves. They should be given the capacities because they have the mental capacities to control themselves. So that's my view. Now, you were going to go on to something else. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Okay, yeah, if I may. The second question is about the political role of women. Yeah, I think you're right, certainly. At least part of the explanation of the difference of men's and women's virtue has to be linked to their different roles, one in the polis, the other in oikos. But I think just to say that that distribution of roles is based on culture is a little unfair to Aristotle. That distribution must have some more philosophical or more natural reasons. But that brings us back to the difference of their rationality or the control of rationality. So I think that's the second question. If we think Aristotle is a great philosopher, he justifies everything with a reason, then we have to say there must be something naturally different. And also, it is also the requirement of political justice, because justice in the city is a kind of distributive justice. It should follow the geometrical proportion. So that means man, how to say it? Man in relation to women equals certain kind of distribution of political power or different places in the city. So that's the second question. So I think you probably
okay. So I certainly think one difficulty from my viewpoint is that or at least one key challenge is to keep pressing on there having to be a natural basis for this gendered hierarchy of tasks in the city. Why would women have to do these things and men have to do those things? And of course, he talks about nature in book 1 of the Politics in a bizarre way. Sorry, I was going to have, I had a counter to the last point about, can you remind me what the last thing you said was?
There must be the political justice, distributive justice.
Yes, okay. So so there's, of course, you'll know, there's this passage where he says that the relationship between women and men is like, it's not a sovereign, it's political. But it's so political is sharing in power, except for women. So it's like one time one person rules, another time another person. But for women and men, it's permanent that the men rule, even though the woman has the same political position or something like this. So it's very odd, it's not as hierarchical as you expect it to be. You'd expect him to say that, the male head of the household is like the king and everyone else is the serfs or something, but he puts it in that way. So there's some equality of value, at least, between the male and female partner, even though there's this permanent rule, the one over the other, which is very difficult to figure out. And Marguerite Delaurier has done a lot of work trying to figure out what that means. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, can I use my privilege to raise 2 follow-up questions, perhaps? It's directly related to Liu's question. I think one is also about the so-called akouros. I think Sophia interprets this claim as saying that women's deliberations do not have external authority, rather the internal authority within her soul. But I was a bit wondering, it seems to be established fact at the time of Aristotle, of course, but it does not give us a reason why Aristotle thinks so. So I want to ask why, according to this interpretation, do you think Aristotle give us a justification or a reason, or that is a natural fact? Because I mean, in this context, Aristotle seems to give us a reason, not only a fact about the situation. And the second question is about the conic acacia. I agree with Sophia that I think Aristotle does not characterize women as conically acratic, but I was wondering why in your argument, you think that chronic acacia is theoretically impossible for Aristotle, because I think if acacia is a stable, deficient disposition, it is of course possible for Aristotle, just as he claimed that people who are naturally melancholic are always in need of cure or treatment. So whether someone acacia is curable or not, I think depends on what kind of person the patient is and how serious the acacia is and other factors. So I'm not sure whether it has been ruled out theoretically from Aristotle's theoretical framework.
Okay,
so
good.
That's the two questions
right.
I have.
Thank you very much, Ray. Yeah, the first one. All right, so if he really does mean that they don't have external authority, but he must think there is a good reason why they don't have external authority. There's some kind of natural reason rather than just reporting what's happening in his society. Yeah, I think it has to do with, I mean, who's going to do the washing up? I mean, that you need these women to be in the oikos and to be doing all of this work in the household. And they're more suited to that. There's something there about, I mean, he doesn't say it directly, but they must, you know, they're more suited to these internal activities as you get in the Xenophon. You know, I think there's one point where he says women are better at guarding stuff and men at going out and getting things and bringing them back for her to guard. A little bit like, you know, one bird that goes and gets stuff and the other stays in and holds onto it. So there is some natural basis there, but I just don't think that it's mental. There was no evidence, there's very little evidence for me that he thinks that women are mentally incapable, and I just disagree with that interpretation. That's the main thing I just don't see happening, and I don't see it happening in his biology when he talks about female animals. They're not less intelligent. In fact, often they're more intelligent than the male animals because they're more sensitive and so on. So there's just this incongruity, and with his attempt to understand nature and this, you know, extreme sexism. So I can't think that it's because they're mentally incapable. You know, physically, yes, you know, they've got smaller bodies, they're softer, those kinds of things. And so they're more suited to the internal work. But the internal work requires intelligence and phronesis, like to a very high degree. It really matters how you raise these young children, like their first impulses. And it's the women standing as the moral exemplars to the young children in the household. The men are not there looking after the small children. So that's one point. The second one, yes, I think I have to be a bit more careful about this point about acrasia. I think I need to nuance it, because I think what I mean is that even if women were a bit more like the melancholics, so had some kind of bodily propensity to intemperance or something, it's not the case that they can't be virtuous. I think that's just all I need. I don't need to say that chronic acrasia is not possible. It is, yes, I accept that chronic acrasia that's not bestiality is, it can be a condition. But the point of writing about it in the Nicomachean Ethics is that we can do something about it. It's curable. You need to just, you know, train your habits and do this and that. And so the point is that even if women have this tendency, it doesn't mean they're incapable of virtue. And that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. I think Wu Yu.
Hello, Professor. Could you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I do not know Aristotle very well. Maybe my question is similar to the professor's. I have two questions. The first one is, according to Aristotle, the virtues of men and women seems belong to the different realms of values. I don't know how Aristotle think about values. It might be related to the different objects they deal with. Then are there any basic normative foundations for the values? If there is, does that mean there are some possibilities to bridge the two realms of values? If not, does that threaten the universal validity of Aristotle's virtue ethics? This is the first one. And the second one is from the perspective of friendship. If there is a friendship between a woman and her husband, is this a corresponding realm of value shared with both women and men? Because for Aristotle, I remember he said a friend is characterized by the other self, and the friends should reinforce the values of each other. Does that mean in the friendship of a woman and his husband that they are equal in this realm of value? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Wu. I'm not sure I understood entirely the first question, but yeah, what I think your worry is that there's this kind of realm of values in the household, and there's a realm of values in the city, and if they don't have overlapping, you know, or if there's no way to connect them, then that seems odd. I guess I think that there are ways to connect. Some of them may not have equivalence in the other. So the feeding of children and what you need for that, maybe there isn't I suppose there might be a sort of feeding of the population. If you're in charge of the distribution of food for the entire city, then that would be similar kind of realm. But obviously the feeding of a family is a much smaller unit of people, and therefore is less noble than doing it for a wider variety of people or for more people. So it's kind of like beneficence on a bigger scale. So I suppose that's part of the reason why what the men are involved with has more value than what the women are involved with, because it's on a broader scale, but it's a similar kinds of things. But some of them might be different enough that they're not comparable. But I think this is helpful to me. I think there might be similar. Some of them might be similar and comparable, like the courage one I'm trying to argue for, which I think is just different realms. Like men are never going to have to give birth, and women seldom have to fight with a sword. But yeah, thank you for that one. Okay, the second one, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's actually difficult to explain this in Aristotelian terms, because it seems as if, at least at this point in the ethics, he's claiming that that husbands and wives should have this virtue friendship. And if that's the case, then you were actually going to have to elevate women's virtues to the level of men's virtues. I mean, if this is really what he means. So it's a challenge to the other side, the side that thinks that women are completely incapable of virtue. But it may be that he just thinks this is quite rare. But it would still be something, it would be an ideal, it would be something to aim towards. And in that case, I think that we have to bring in things like women and men talking about politics together at home. And we have examples of this in some Greek literature, where the men are listening to their wives and their daughters and what their wives and their daughters are telling them in the home, and they're bringing it back out to the law courts. And so he'd have to sort of have something like that, because they would have that kind of ability to influence each other in their ethical lives.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Liu Zhe.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Sophia. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I'm not specialized in Aristotle, but just wondering, because you try to show a kind of continuity between this male and female virtues in Aristotle, but because of you said there's a kind of restriction of female activities in the domain of household. Certainly the content of the major virtues for ancient Greek people, they have very different contents. So then I'm just wondering what kind of continuity you actually presuppose here, whether that is a kind of capacity for the different, the women or men, or it's just the same content which must be specialized in different areas, or it means something else, or maybe just the categories like temperance, courage, you know, this name which you acknowledge here. So I'm just wondering what kind of continuity, whether that is it's the same quality of virtues with a quantitative difference or something else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify, I wanted to say a little bit more about these restrictions on women that would cause them to not be able to pursue some of the virtues that Aristotle talks about in his Ethics. They can't have their own property. So he talks about generosity and how to distribute your wealth. Well, women can't do that. So they're not going to be able to have that, the way he describes it, at least. They're not going to be able to do this the way he describes it in the Ethics. Also, something about free movement. So he talks about, and this is not a moral virtue, but it's an ethical, a virtue about living, you know, about character. And he says that men will be witty, and they'll go to parties and they'll tell jokes, and people will laugh, you know, a little bit, but not too much. Well, women can't. I mean, typically women couldn't do that. They couldn't freely move around the city going and meeting people and telling jokes. However, both of these things you could put in the context of a woman's life, because she may have some extra sewing materials that she shares with her friends, or she might be witty within her household with you know, people, other women and friends within her household. So those things, we could sort of transpose them to a woman's life. But the main answer to your question would be, therefore, that they are, as long as you have some resources, then you can have these dispositions, these capacities to respond appropriately in any given situation, which is what a virtue is for Aristotle. And that's an internal state or capacity or attitude that you cultivate. And at one point he says, yes, you do need external goods for virtue. So there's internal goods are the most, but the internal goods are the most important things, but you need some external goods as well. For instance, for generosity, you'll need some money. But he doesn't overemphasize that. It's not about the externals that makes you a good person, because you could fall into ruin. And as long as you were virtuous, you could still be happy. You could have everything taken away. I mean, this happens to men in ancient, in lots of cases in his culture. They are, you know, he himself, he's exiled, you know, he loses this and capacity to exercise virtues in Athens. He's exiled somewhere else, but he can exercise them in the exiled state. So yeah, so I think I want to emphasize that those external resources aren't as important to Aristotelian virtues.
May I just quickly follow up? Well, if the virtue somehow must require a kind of cultivation, and women, even though, you know, this original source is the same, a kind of continuous with men's, but then the problem is the cultivation so different from each other. Then I'm just wondering whether one is justified to say, look, you know, because of the different cultivation, women, for Aristotle, is still less virtuous than men are.
Yeah. I'm not sure what you mean by the different cultivation. There's not I mean, there are only hints in his writing about the, you know, the moral education of children. It has to do with exemplars and training, but you know, it's not clear.
I'm not that familiar with this, you know, the organization, the constitution of the ancient Greek, you know, the life. But I'm just thinking, for instance, like household, even though there's distributive justice, even though we still need a kind of courage and also the other virtues, but still the constitution of this household is less, you know, complicated than the police, you know. So in this sense, the kind of the cultivation is certainly different from each other, right? Even though you might say, okay, look, that is only a kind of quantitative difference. But I think here probably it's just a qualitative difference.
I raise my hands on Zoom. I'm waiting to be called to ask the question.
Yeah, no, I completely see. So actually this is helpful to explaining why the men's virtue is more valuable. you say like it's just more difficult to, you know, to be a politician and to be a housekeeper. Is that your point?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, personally, I mean, I'm not so sure, but but I'm sure that's the attitude. Yes. But I mean, empirically, I'm not sure that this is true, or depending on the circumstances.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, Misha, I'm sorry I didn't notice you raising hand. Misha? Misha?
Oh, hi. I'm sorry. I'm outside to do the PCR test. Just give me a second. Where is it? Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. Actually, it feels like, even just by listening, it feels like that you took us to, you know, travel back to the time and the space that Aristotle lived and how he viewed everything about women and gender roles in general for societal development. But we understand, we understand that like Aristotle was kind of like a Western philosophical founding father in a way. And from there, like, you know, Western societies has developed in its own style. And I have just one question, very quick. I wonder if he had left some space for modern days us to think about, to challenge his arguments, and like, and how that can possibly link to, you know, the realities, the recent decades, the actual feminism movement, or actually in Western societies actually happening in Asia. So yes, very quick. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Misha. I mean, yes, I mean, it's partly what I said at the beginning is that some of what I'm doing is almost reimagining a better Aristotle. So if he'd really followed his principles concerning virtue, then it should have been the case that even within his society, he would have thought of these women as courageous. He would have thought of these women as, you know, amazingly temperate. He would have, you know, he would have championed them. And the only place that he really champions them is as mothers, as the love that mothers have for their children, which he does seem to think is so incredibly important that he uses it as the example in various places in his ethics, in both of his Nicomachean and his Eudemian ethics. And so I think there are seeds there of regarding what women did as heroic in some way, in the way that they cared for their families, and of course we can think of that as very sexist now. Women don't have to have children, so you know, why would we care about that? But so I think it's tricky because Aristotle's often seen as a person who set up the world to be the terrible sexist place, the Western world to be the terrible sexist place it's been for the last 2,300 years. But I think sometimes it's good to look back at him and think from our perspective what we can find there. And not turn away from it. Like the problem I think is sometimes is turning away from it, saying, I don't want to even look at it because it's sexist. But I think you have to engage with it and look at it and try and understand it, and try and see it in a better light. That's what I'm trying to do.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. I'm done with my question. Thank you.
I hope you feel better soon.
So, okay, next one, Ge Tianqing.
Okay, thank you very much. And hello, Professor Connell. Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And I just want to ask a somewhat general question. I was wondering how you consider the physiological or biological basis of the difference of virtue in women and men. You mentioned the biological influence with regard to the temperance, but what about the other ethical virtues? And another relevant point is that how strong is this biological or physiological influence for Aristotle? And I think this is also interesting, and how Aristotle plays on this basis, this how Aristotle makes use of this kind of physiological basis for his somewhat sexualist view. And this is my question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I did mention it because what happens is that in the womb, the female child has less heat, and so her the woman, the female, develops more slowly and has a smaller body and has softer skin and what's the other one? Softer flesh, and smaller veins, and there's various things that differentiate men and women that then result in them having differentiated
Sorry, you have muted your microphone. Sorry.
So yeah, so it results in them having differently sexed bodies in terms of reproduction and producing different seminal fluids, as we know. So that's the physical difference between men and women.
Yes.
Now, the problem is he doesn't directly say that's going to affect their capacity for virtues or for particular virtues, but we can infer that from some of the things he says, and we can infer that from the different bodies. He says something, as we saw, about the melancholics having different softer bodies. So we can therefore think that women are going to be more like the melancholics. So temperance is going to be a challenge. The other one is that I mentioned was mildness. So they are going to be less spirited. And he talks about this. So this is a clue we get from zoology, from the Historia Animalium, where female animals are less spirited than male animals. By the way, they're also tend to be more intelligent, and the male animals more stupid. But anyway, I won't go into that. So they won't be as prone to these angry kind of vices. So in that sense, it's weighing these things up, is which are they more prone to because of their bodily constitution. But what I can find in Aristotle's Ethics is that he says that people will differ from one another in their bodily constitutions, but that this won't mean that they can't be virtuous if they're not off the scale into a kind of pathology. And so I believe personally that women are, they're going to differ in their bodily constitution, but that not so much that they won't be able to be virtuous.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we have somebody called Gang Yi who's written in the chat, how can I raise my hand?
I think Connell, Sophia, perhaps you can answer the first question from
the first question in the chat.
Yes.
I avoided that because I didn't quite understand it, but I'll read it out from Yu Cheng Shu. Could I ask a simple question? According to Aristotle's teleology, could women's virtue be connected to women's potentia set by Aristotle?
I also don't understand.
I'm not sure if that means women's passivity, possibly.
Perhaps the possibility.
Women are potential and male actual, but I don't think that's what he actually says in the biology. Teleology. So in terms of teleology, let's see. I mean, he says both animals are complete. They reach their telos when they become either male or female. So in that sense, a woman is a complete female animal. I can't think, I mean, in terms of his theory of the reproduction, the male role is as efficient cause, and the female role is the material cause. So there's a teleological structure to generation where the male plays the active role and the female plays passive role. So in that sense, there's maybe that's what she means, that the women is the passive. But I don't see that connected to virtue. I basically don't see that connected to virtue. So how they make babies isn't connected to to being an ethical human being. This is a kind of biological theory of reproduction. So I don't see it connected, but other people might, and other people have written about that. So yeah. Okay, so there was then the question, on the chat from somebody who didn't know how to raise their hand.
Yeah, I have also answered this question. Okay. No problem. And the next question, I think, Ying.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
I'm sorry if I'm talking about some. It's a little bit maybe offensive. It's like Aristotle has excluded women from discussion in his book, and after so many years, you as a women professor like you, a woman would like to find a better version of him, and defend him as a less sexist person. So I see this interaction as a proof of women virtue, but also as sarcastic a little bit. So if someone would like to evaluate your research as sarcastic one, what do you think of this? Or in other words, how will you reply to this? That's my question. Sorry.
I'm not sure if it is sarcastic or ironic. Did you mean ironic?
Yes, ironic. Yes, a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is difficult for me to answer. I suppose what I'm interested in is finding out more about what Aristotle thought in his works that's not simplified. Like, I think that there's so much, misogyny and sexism, but that there are other things there as well that you can overlook if you're only thinking, how shall I bash Aristotle about being a sexist? And quite frankly, everyone was a sexist in my life, in my world until about 50 years ago. Anything that you read by Bertrand, stuff you can read by Bertrand Russell or, I don't know, Hume, or, I mean, they're horribly sexist, but that doesn't mean that we don't study their works and try and figure out what they were thinking about. So I think it's in that spirit, but it's also wanting to look at what he says about women and female animals, because we can't just turn away from that. We have to look at it directly, but not look at it and just say he was a horrible sexist, because that stops you thinking about it. It stops you looking at it more carefully. It's just a complete dismissal, and it's not that you can take the sexist bits and chuck them away, because they're interwoven with what he thinks about a lot of different things. So I guess that's what I would say.
Yes, I think I understand you. It's like to look at him with more caution, and I just think this interaction is interesting. So that's I just want to.
And I take your point, and I think that there are plenty of female scholars who are looking for all the bad bits and writing them out in detail. I know some of them, and I don't agree, because what the problem I have with that is that they come up with this amazingly coherent picture of all of his entire theory of why women and female animals are bad. I say, when I read him, I don't find that. I find a lot of tensions actually he doesn't and can't come up with a coherent theory, because he thinks female animals are intelligent. He thinks they do all this stuff with parenting. They do all these important things. He can't even do it in his theory of reproduction. He tries, but then he finds out that the females, lay the eggs. They, some of them even reproduce on their own. He doesn't stop himself from documenting these parthenogenetic animals that reproduce on their own. He then says, of course, when you have hybrid animals, the animals start looking more like the females. And he tries to explain this, but it's completely, convoluted. I mean, it's just not one really clear system of, denigrating females on all levels. He just doesn't do that.
Yes, okay, thank you. I'm done with my question. Thank you.
Okay, then next one, Yigang.
Hello, Sophia.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your speech, and it's wonderful. And I have a simple question. You said that women's virtues differs from men's virtues due to the objects, and you give me such an impression that maybe the men and the women they have only such differences because of their different social situations. And so if women have the same, if the women get the same chance like the men, then they should also be allowed to rule the city. But here, so can we say that if we don't, maybe I should express it like this. So if it is so, then in Plato's Republic, so when Plato discusses about the differences of the nature of men and women, and he said that there is no difference with regards to their nature. But Aristotle criticizes Plato, but then it is very difficult to understand, because in the situation of the Republic, when Plato says that there is no difference between the nature of men and the nature of women, so he has he doesn't think about the social situations. That means social situation is not considered. So why should Aristotle criticize Plato in this point? And Aristotle said that women are not qualified to rule the city. So it's very strange. So.
Thank you very much for this question. Brilliant. Okay. Yes. So the way that Aristotle critiques Plato, or Socrates, as he says in book 2 of the Politics, is he says, oh, well, we're not like dogs because we have the oikos, we have the household. So he doesn't say we're not like dogs because women can't think properly and female dogs can. He says we're not like dogs because we have the household. And this is really important because, yes, Plato is a radical thinker who wants to eliminate the raising of children within a household. He'll send them all to the creche when they're newborn, so the women can keep on with their full-time job in the city. And they'll go to the creche, they'll have a big wall, and there'll be a hole in the wall for them to feed the baby without seeing it, because they're not going to get attached to the baby, and then they'll go back to work. So Aristotle just has actually principled reasons why he disagrees with this way of raising children. He thinks they should be raised in the household. He thinks that people should have personal connections to their families. And that's why partly why we need the oikos, because if you break down the relationship, personal relationship between people, you can't maintain unity in the city. That Plato and Socrates were actually wrong about that. So he thinks that, he says that if you know, in the Republic, Plato says, oh, well, we'll just treat everyone like a brother. When we see a male, you know, about our age, we'll say, hey, brother, you're my close brother. But Aristotle says this is not going to work. He's not your brother. You can't take a drop of wine and pour it into the ocean and expect it all to become wine. So that's where I think the disagreement is, and not in the intellect of women, but in the setup of the city, which Aristotle argues for as more of a continuation of the way it is now, whereas Plato wants a completely radical break, at least within the elite class.
So another question. So I had your answer, and I think it's plausible, and I think so. You see that for Aristotle, our happiness should not depend upon our fortune. So
yeah, he does say this in one part of the Ethics. Yeah, he says, unless things get really bad, you know, unless you're Priam and you lose your 50 sons and your city is burnt down, you should be able to cope with bad fortune.
Yes. So how do we say? So the difference between Aristotle's opinion and Plato's opinion is that Aristotle thinks that the social situation, the actual social situation is maybe what we can't change. And but the problem is, if we agree with Plato, so if we change our social situations, then even the women, they can choose to live a philosophical life, and they can attain such a highest happiness. So it's this. So I think maybe this is more like. So if we think that happiness doesn't depend upon fortune, then maybe we should change our social situations. And it's just what Plato does. So maybe Plato, so the ideal city, the just city of Plato, maybe we can say it's impossible or it's unjust, but maybe principally, so we can build another city, another ideal city, but not the ideal city of Plato, but another city, and then we can realize this ideal that happiness doesn't depend upon our fortune or our social situations.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is that Plato has more imagination here to at least try to begin to think about different social situations that wouldn't mean that women always had this bad fortune of being unable to access these resources, to have the higher, you know, to have the better or more comprehensive virtues. Yeah. Yes, and I think if you look at politics and Aristotle's Politics, book 7 and 8, where he talks about the city of our dreams, where he may be imagining how to set up a colony from scratch, the gender differences are still there. And as I said, if we were thinking more along, if he were being more imaginative, he probably could have, well, I don't know, he should have thought something else. But I will say that, yes, the Republic, but in the laws, you don't get quite the same setup. And in the laws, actually, Plato can be quite negative about women. And he says even a woman's natural potential for virtue is inferior to a man's. That's what he says in the laws. And Aristotle never, says that directly, but although he may have have thought it, as we've said. So yeah, I agree. There's some, you know, and there's something. Plato is better on women than Aristotle. I give you that. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's my question. Thank you.
Oh, okay, perhaps one question in the chat box.
Yes, this is a good one. So could you explain a little more about how Aristotle excluded women from philosophy? What makes philosophy a man-only thing? Yeah, we don't know a huge amount about this. It's just really, the only bit I can think of is from the Poetics, where he says that you shouldn't depict women as being clever in your plays. And he gives the example of a play by Euripides called Melipone the Wise. But we don't have this play, we just have fragments of it. From what we can see from the fragments, Melipone, it does something very similar to pre-Socratic philosophy. She's saying some things that are a bit like what Anaxagoras says about mind controlling the world and bringing the stars into being and things like that. So it looks as if he doesn't approve of playwrights depicting women being clever, and he says things about it not being appropriate. But other than that, there's not a lot of reasons, a rationale within his philosophy for why women shouldn't do philosophy. But we do know he didn't have, unlike Plato, he didn't have any female students in his school, because Plato is known to have had at least 2 female students in the academy. And of course, Socrates goes around talking to women when he's doing his philosophy. And we don't see any evidence of that in Aristotle. So it's a bit of a mystery, you know, and particularly when you look in more detail about what he says about women's constitution, the fact that they don't have to engage in political matters, they're freed up from that. And if they had any leisure time within the home, philosophy would be the perfect activity for them. So it's it's a book written by Judith Swanson, which argues that according to Aristotle's principles, women should be doing philosophy. They should be pretty good at philosophy. So he doesn't say that they can't, but it's clear that he doesn't approve of it. He thinks it's inappropriate, or at least inappropriate to depict it in plays. So thank you for that question.
So, okay, next one, Zheng Zhonghua.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks, Professor Connell, and it's an illuminating talk. I just have a very, very generous question, and perhaps it's not so related to your talk today. And I just wonder how much weight should we give to Aristotle's theory of biology, or his, well, in general, saying that his theory of nature, when we consider Aristotle's views of ethical views? Because I think there's perhaps a growing tendency in Aristotelian scholarship that scholars pay more attention to Aristotle's biological views, and they try to make connections between these two. And I just like to hear some of your voices, some of your views. And thank you. That's my question.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I used to be more resistant to making connections between his biology and his politics. For instance, in my book, I argue that we should be careful doing this sort of thing. I think that was made too often very quickly from, you know, for instance, women being passive in generation to women themselves as ethical agents being passive, and then to men must rule over them. Now, I don't think I find that in connection. But I have read more now about how within Aristotle's ethical works, he has theoretical precepts and definitions and theories that match up to things in his natural, in his works on nature and his other theoretical works. For instance, you've got to know something about the soul in order to understand moral psychology. Even if it's not to the level of reading De Anima, you still need to know something. And in that setting, you need to know, to understand the politics, you do need to know a bit about human beings as social animals, a little bit, you know, of theoretical biology. That although his practical philosophy is not purely practical, if this makes sense. Okay, I'll try and explain. So he has a distinction between theoretical, productive, and practical knowledge. But actually, his ethical works are not works of practical knowledge. He's not telling you what to do on a day-to-day basis. He doesn't give you a guide to, what to do, in particular situations. Like it's not a self-help book. It's a theoretical book about virtue, where we define, about ethics, where we define virtue, we analyze happiness, we get into the soul, and in the politics, that there are these definitions and these descriptions that allow for a certain overlap with his works of natural philosophy.
Yes, thank you. Can I just have a very, very quick follow-up? You give me the impression that you think that Aristotle's ethics have a very strong analogy to his science of, for example, nature, and you think there can be first principles and there can be definitions. So, but I know this view can be controversial. So maybe you can say something a bit more about this. And
well, I mean, there are people who are more expert on this than I am. I mean, there's a recent, there's a couple of recent books about that. But yeah, there is an argument to be had towards that view of the ethics. And you're right, it's controversial, but I have some sympathies for it. But I don't have a huge amount to say because it's not my own research. I just use the research of others to support some of the connections that I see.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm done.
Okay, we still have a few minutes. Perhaps Liu Wei have a few.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If I'm not so interested. Just two very, very quick questions related to your discussion about particular virtues. One is about courage, the other is about magnanimity. So in your discussion about courage, you said that, well, to give birth to babies is something noble because it's for the common good. I'm not sure whether this would be Aristotle's view, because to give birth to kids, to maintain the city, it seems to be something necessary. And for Aristotle, necessity and nobility are something in contrast, I would say. Mm-hmm. So this is the first small question. The second one is about your view about magnanimity. It seems that you say that those generous mothers, by giving so much love to their kids and so much love to the family, they deserve some kind of honor. So in that sense, they are to a certain extent magnanimous. But I think that's not Aristotle's view about magnanimity. Magnanimity is about one's own attitude toward honor. And they think that they are deserving great honors. But that's certainly not the attitude of a generous mother. Okay, those are the two questions.
Yeah, because it's in my mind first about magnanimity. Yeah, absolutely. So the point is that you, the magnanimous person, the problem is that there are all these people that think they deserve honor and they're wrong. And that's where the discussion of beneficence comes in, and where he says it actually isn't as important to be honored as it is to be beneficent. But yeah, and I take your point that the woman is not thinking that she should be honored. But I think there's a hint there that that a less good woman might think, what's wrong? There's something wrong here. I'm not being honored as a mother. Whereas the virtuous mother doesn't require the honor because she knows the value of beneficence. Okay, so that's the second one. The first one, so producing good children, and in the knowledge that this is important for the city, I think has a connection to valuing what's fine and noble for the community. If you look at book 7 and 8 of the Politics, you actually have to study medical writings in order to be able to try to have the best children at the best time in your life. And he's going to have to involve the female actors here as well, because they're going to have to discuss, when shall we try to have this baby and how will we raise it and so on. So I actually think that it is connected. And although, of course, it's necessary to have physical people in your city, once there are people planning to have children, this is a moral and ethical situation. It's not merely a physical, a kind of biological one. Yes, humans that make animals mate with each other so they can have some working animals, but the animals aren't in control there, and humans are in control of themselves in these regards. And this is something that they decide to do. It's not just that's how he wants it to be anyway, that people are deciding to procreate at a certain time for certain reasons in the right situation, and not just randomly having children.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so we are already running out of time. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending and sharing your ideas today. So let's thank Sophia again. So we end these sections.
I had a question for you, which is whether there were any parallels to this kind of thinking in the Chinese tradition of virtues of women being in the household and men in the community.
I don't know whether we have an expert in Chinese philosophy or tradition. Perhaps Liu Wei.
Well, definitely not me, but I think there is a very strong tradition in China. Sorry, there's some kind of construction work going on in my building. Yeah, kind of similar to Aristotle. In the Confucian tradition.
I thought there might be.
And also women are confined in oikos. Yeah, and they also educate the kids. Yeah.
But there's some value in that. Like there's some virtue or value in those women's activities, would you say, in that tradition?
Yeah, we have the tradition called the virtue of women, women's virtue.
Right.
Something. Yeah.
Yes. But
right.
It's very stringent.
Very.
Constrained.
There's a kind of guidelines or regulations of what kind of things women are supposed to do and supposed not to do, this kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay.
I know we even have a catalog of women who have the so-called the female virtue or virtue of women, I think in the Han Dynasty.
Okay. And do they not overlap with the men's virtues? Are they completely different? Or they?
I think they are different, but I'm not sure to what extent there are some overlapping thing. Basically, I think they are different, but I cannot exclude some overlap.
Those virtues are more like regulations for women, like rules or something. Is that fair?
Perhaps, but personally, I didn't read such books, so I'm not quite sure about the concrete content, I think.
Okay. We will try our best to explore this for you.
So if you need, we can do further research.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So goodbye, everyone.